North Korea has responded to sanctions imposed on them by the United Nations Security Council, calling the measures an act of war. The UN placed sanctions on the country following a series of weapons tests. The most recent test fired a ballistic missile nearly 3,000 miles into the air.
We start with North Korea's response to the latest UN sanctions slapped on the regime following its missile test in late November. Pyongyang says the U.S. should wake up from its pipe dream of the regime ever giving up its nuclear programs. Lee Jung-yeon has more.
North Korea has denounced the latest UN sanctions, calling them an act of war and vowing to retaliate against the U.S. sympathizers who approved it. According to the North Korean Central News Agency, the regime's foreign ministry called on the U.S. to abandon what it called its hostile policy toward North Korea and learn to coexist. The North also claimed that its weapons are solely for self-defense and that the U.S. should wake up from its pipe dream of it ever giving them up. The latest sanctions were passed unanimously on Friday. They slashed North Korea's imports of refined oil products like gasoline, require all North Koreans overseas to return home within 24 months, and they further restrict shipping. This comes about a month after the regime's latest ballistic missile launch that Kim Jong-un claims can target the entire United States, and a week after U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson called out Russia and China for supporting the regime. Meanwhile, North Korea held a gathering in Pyongyang this past week of lower-level officials in the ruling Workers' Party, the first such meeting in 5 years. The regime's state-run media has reported that leader Kim Jong-un gave a speech on Saturday saying everything the party has done so far is just the beginning, and that it will come up with more business ideas that will be carried out aggressively to build a stronger socialist state.
Now, peace activist Ryan Dawson says the U.S. is not communicating well with North Korea in order to end the tensions with the East Asian country.
They always offer the stick and never the carrot. And there's nothing, no concessions made by the United States. They're not talking about ending the war games, which are mock invasions in North Korea. And the sanctions, they already have sanctions. They're just making them a little bit tighter, and they're not communicating very well. So it's hard for North Korea to understand what the United States wants when the Secretary of State saying we're willing to talk and negotiate with no preconditions, which they were saying as recently as 2 weeks ago. And now it's back to tighter sanctions through the UN and Donald Trump making his normal threats on Twitter and so on. The U.S. is using North Korea as a pretext to sell billions of dollars worth of equipment to South Korea and Japan and have an excuse to be in the South China Sea, supposedly for North Korea. But we all know that those radars from THAAD are pointed at China and Russia. We all know that this arms export is good for its own financial interests. It has nothing to do with North Korea.
North Korea sounding off after a fresh round of sanctions from the UN Security Council in response to its missile launch late last month. The new sanctions limiting Pyongyang's access to oil and forcing North Korean workers in other countries to return home. The rogue regime calling the sanctions a, quote, act of war and threatening to retaliate against nations who supported them. Joining now is Kieran Skinner, professor of international relations at Carnegie Mellon University, a research fellow at Hoover Institution, and a Fox News foreign policy analyst. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. You know, North Korea seems to call everything an act of war. Every single time we do joint military exercises with South Korea, North Korea calls it an act of war. So, you know, why does Kim Jong-un do this, and at what point are we going to take it seriously?
Well, the newest sanctions are so dauntingly punitive that I think there's nothing else for the North Korean leader to say. Not only are they punitive, but they are unanimous, with much of the world behind the U.S.-led sanctions resolution. And that further isolates the regime. And it will hurt its economy, and the ability of the leadership to continue to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile program. So his rhetoric doesn't compare to the reality of what the world has just done.
You know, North Korea also has vowed that every country that voted in favor of the resolution would face retaliation from North Korea. So presumably that would mean Russia and China. What do you make of that?
North Korea is out of options in terms of retaliation because it attempts to play nuclear blackmail. The problem with using that type of lack of diplomacy, if you will, is that you have no other options below. What can it do to the world but threaten some type of nuclear maneuver that would immediately hurt the Chinese, of which it is attached to territorially. So I think it's just really rhetoric and desperation.
Well, how do you think these sanctions will actually be implemented? Because in the past, the problem is the sanctions haven't been implemented as they were supposed to be by the countries involved.
The fact that we've had numerous now unanimous sanctions resolutions and that the United States is continuing to pressure the great powers that have signed on to the sanctions resolutions like the Chinese and Russians, and given that the fact that the Chinese and Russians are part of the sanctions resolutions, they are the only allies of North Korea, I think speaks to the capacity to get a much more universal compliance with them. But also they hit so many sectors all at the same time that I think their effectiveness will be much superior to ones in the past. Textiles, for example, are now banned. The importing of North Korean textiles. The North Korean workers, more than 90,000, are being recalled home from abroad within 2 years, and they've accounted for additional hard currency for the country. You just go down the list. And I think these sanctions really will work.
That's true, and yet today the AP is reporting that U.S. officials say that, when North Korean coal exports were forbidden, shiploads would basically be channeled through Russia. Sometimes goods and products would be switched from ship to ship out at sea in order to avoid sanctions being implemented.
Yes, there's more ship-to-ship compliance, I think, in the newest round of sanctions because there are ways to check for compliance that didn't exist in the past. But also, the Russians and Chinese simply have much more skin in the game this time because North Korea is so out of control with the development of its nuclear program against prior UN resolutions that the Chinese and North Koreans, the Chinese and the Russians have really taken notice. They don't want an all-out war. It will be devastating for them in addition to the rest of the world.
Well, I should mention that China actually has a defense agreement with North Korea, so it's sort of to be determined what would happen if North Korea were to get into a military action with another country, including the U.S. But I want to bring this up. There's a thought that Kim Jong-un is absolutely unwilling to give up his nuclear program, that he essentially ties that to his own life and to his own staying in power, that he believes that Colonel Gaddafi would still be in place, that Hussein would still be alive if they had nuclear weapons. What do you say to that ideology, that he simply isn't going to give up his nuclear weapons program?
Yes, he's created this dangerous scenario where his regime survival and his own personal survival is tied to his nuclear program. This is an odd type of nuclear deterrence. The problem is that he's got to be able to continually convince the elites in his own country that the whole country's survival is tied to his survival, which is tied to the nuclear program. If there's any break away from him among elites, those in the military, those in China that he depends on, I think then he's taken a risky gambit, and it may not work.
All right, well, we shall see. Kyra and Skinner, thank you for your insight today.
Thank you.
We start in the U.S., where Defense Secretary James Mattis says the best way for America to avoid war is for its troops are quote, ready to go. Speaking to soldiers on Friday, he said U.S. diplomats rely on the military's preparedness, which allows them to speak with authority in negotiations. Won Jong-wan has more.
Storm clouds are gathering over the Korean peninsula U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said on Friday. Mattis was speaking to soldiers and airmen at the 82nd Airborne Division's Hall of Heroes in North Carolina as part of his holiday tour of bases to greet troops. He didn't go so far as to predict armed conflict, but he said America will have the best chance of preventing one if its words are backed up by a strong military. A military that is ready to take action, he said, will give weight to the words of diplomats as they try to put an end to North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Mattis's remarks came as the United Nations adopted tough new sanctions on North Korea, seeking to ban around 90% of the regime's imports of refined petroleum products. While the defense secretary has highlighted the importance of military preparedness, telling the troops to read the book, A Study in Unpreparedness, published in a decade after the Korean War ended in 1953, to get an idea of what went wrong the last time around. Reports have suggested recently that the U.S. was considering evacuating the families of military personnel in South Korea, but Mattis said it hasn't reached that point yet. Mattis' remarks came as South Korea prepares to host the Winter Olympics in February in Pyeongchang, just 80 kilometers from demilitarized zone. Although analysts have warned that North Korea could try to disrupt the games with provocations, Mattis said he thinks that's unlikely.